Mateo Wesley was 34 years old, and until last Saturday night, he believed that respect in a marriage was something you earn through love, not money. He worked as a high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon, pulling in about $62,000 a year. It was honest work, the kind that let him sleep at night and look his students in the eye. His wife, Vanessa, was a corporate attorney at one of the city's top firms, making nearly 4 times what he did. Mateo had never had a problem with that. He'd married her because she made him laugh, because she challenged him, because when she looked at him, he felt seen. But her family? They'd always looked at him like he was something stuck to the bottom of their Italian leather shoes. The Caldwell family, old money from Seattle's tech boom, the kind of wealth that whispers instead of shouts. Vanessa's father, Richard, had founded a software company in the 90s that he'd sold for an amount Mateo had only heard whispered at family gatherings. Her mother, Patricia, spent her days on charity boards and her evenings reminding everyone within earshot about their summer home in the San Juan Islands. Vanessa's older brother, Trevor, worked in venture capital and wore watches that cost more than Mateo's annual salary. And then there was Vanessa's 30th birthday party. Mateo had been planning it for months. He'd watched Vanessa work herself to exhaustion on a major corporate merger, seen the stress lines deepen around her eyes, heard her crying softly in the bathroom when she thought he was asleep. She deserved something special, something that would remind her why she pushed herself so hard, to build the life they both wanted. So Mateo had done something he'd never done before. He'd reached out to his grandmother's estate lawyer. His grandmother, Eleanor Wesley, had passed away 8 months earlier. She'd been a quiet woman, a first-generation immigrant who'd worked as a seamstress in San Francisco's Chinatown for 40 years. Mateo had visited her every Sunday, bringing her groceries and stories from his classroom. She'd never seemed wealthy. She'd lived in the same small apartment for decades, mended her own clothes, clipped coupons. But Eleanor Wesley had been smart with money, very smart. When her lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had contacted Mateo 6 months after her death, he'd explained that Eleanor had invested wisely over the decades. Real estate purchases in the Bay Area before the boom, conservative stock portfolios that had grown steadily. The estate was worth just over $2 million, and Mateo was the sole heir. Mateo had been stunned. He'd cried in Mr. Harrison's office, overwhelmed by his grandmother's sacrifice and foresight. She could have lived comfortably, could have traveled, could have enjoyed the fruits of her labor. Instead, she'd saved it all for him. He hadn't told anyone yet, not even Vanessa. He wanted to be smart about it, to meet with financial advisors, to understand the tax implications, to plan their future carefully. But when Vanessa's birthday approached, Mateo knew exactly what he wanted to do with a portion of it. He'd booked the entire top floor of the observatory, Portland's most exclusive event venue, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. He'd hired the chef from Vanessa's favorite restaurant to cater a 5-course dinner. He'd arranged for a string quartet, for custom floral arrangements of white orchids, Vanessa's favorite, for personalized champagne cocktails. He'd invited 60 of Vanessa's closest friends, colleagues, and family members. The total cost? Just under $45,000. It was extravagant by Mateo's usual standards, but it was for Vanessa. And honestly, a small part of him wanted to show her family that he could give their daughter something extraordinary, even if it wasn't in the way they expected. He'd planned everything down to the last detail, working with the venue's event coordinator, a sharp woman named Diana who'd been incredibly professional. Mateo had put down the deposit 3 months ago, paid the balance 2 weeks before the event, and had Diana's assurance that everything would be perfect. What Mateo hadn't anticipated was how the Caldwell family would treat the entire evening. From the moment Patricia Caldwell stepped off the elevator into the observatory's elegant reception area, her expression had soured. "Oh," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment the wealthy reserve for things that don't quite meet their standards. "How quaint. I assumed we'd be at the Sentinel Club. That's where we celebrated Trevor's 30th. Richard had barely acknowledged Mateo, heading straight for the bar with Trevor in tow. Vanessa's Aunt Michelle, her mother's sister, had wrinkled her nose at the champagne selection. Domestic? She'd murmured to Patricia, loud enough for Mateo to hear. I thought this was supposed to be a special occasion. Mateo had swallowed his irritation. He was used to their subtle jabs, their casual cruelty disguised as observations. He'd smiled, helped guests with their coats, made small talk with Vanessa's colleagues from the law firm who, at least, seemed genuinely impressed by the venue. Vanessa had been radiant in a midnight blue dress, her eyes bright with surprise and happiness when she'd walked in to find all her favorite people gathered. She'd kissed Mateo, whispered, "You didn't have to do all this," in his ear, and for a moment, everything felt worth it. If you enjoy stories of sweet revenge, shocking family secrets, and justice against the wealthy, like this video and subscribe to the channel now. There are brand new stories here every day, each one more intense than the last one, and tell me where you are watching from. The dinner had been spectacular. The seared scallops with truffle risotto, the herb-crusted lamb, the deconstructed lemon tart that had Vanessa's colleagues raving. Mateo had watched Vanessa laugh with her friends, had seen her relax for the first time in months, and he'd felt proud. But then Trevor had stood up during dessert. "I'd like to propose a toast," Trevor had announced, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone who'd never been told to sit down. "To my baby sister Vanessa, 30 years old and at the top of her game." He'd pause for effect. "And to Mateo, who clearly pulled out all the stops tonight. Must have taken, what, 2 years of teacher salary to afford this?" He'd laughed, and several of Vanessa's relatives had joined in. Mateo's jaw had tightened, but he'd kept smiling. Vanessa had stopped her brother a warning look, but Trevor had just grinned and continued. I'm kidding. In all seriousness, it's sweet, really. The effort is adorable." Trevor had raised his glass. "To Vanessa, who deserves the world, and to Mateo, who does his best with what he has." The condescension had hung in the air like smoke. Mateo had seen the flash of anger in Vanessa's eyes, but before she could say anything, Patricia had chimed in. "It really is lovely, Mateo," she'd said in that same tone she might use to compliment a child's finger painting. "I'm sure this must have set you back quite a bit. You really shouldn't have stretched yourself so thin. We could have helped, you know. We always do." Richard had nodded, swirling his scotch. "Next time, just say something. We can arrange something at the Sentinel Club. My membership covers events like this." Mateo had felt the heat rising in his chest, that particular cocktail of humiliation and rage that comes from being talked down to by people who measure worth in dollar signs. But he'd bitten his tongue. This was Vanessa's night. He wouldn't ruin it. What he didn't know was that Diana, the event coordinator, had been standing just behind him, tablet in hand, preparing for the cake presentation. And Diana had heard every word. She'd also been present when Mateo had paid the full balance for the event. She knew exactly who had made this evening possible. "Excuse me, everyone," Diana had said, her voice professional but firm. "If I could have your attention for just a moment before we bring out the birthday cake." The room had quieted, guests turning toward her with polite curiosity. "I'm Diana Morrison, the senior event coordinator here at the observatory. I just wanted to take a moment to thank the person who made tonight possible." She'd smiled directly at the Caldwell family table. "It's not every day we work with clients who have such a clear vision and the resources to execute it perfectly." Trevor had smirked, raising his glass toward his father as if accepting the acknowledgement on behalf of the family. But Diana had turned to face Mateo directly. "Mr. Wesley, we want to thank you for choosing the observatory for your wife's celebration. The $45,000 investment you made in tonight's event has resulted in what I think we can all agree is a spectacular evening." Her voice had carried clearly across the now silent room. From the full venue buyout, to the custom menu by Chef Rodriguez, to the imported orchid arrangements, Every detail reflects your generosity and your love for your wife. We're honored to have been part of it." Mateo had watched the color drain from Trevor's face. Patricia's mouth had opened slightly, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Richard had actually looked up from his scotch, his expression shifting from bored indifference to confusion. Vanessa had turned to Mateo, her eyes wide with questions. "Wait," Trevor had said, his voice sharp. "What did you just say?" Diana had consulted her tablet with professional efficiency. "Mr. Wesley booked this event 3 months ago and paid the full balance 2 weeks ago. The $45,000 cost covered the venue rental, catering, entertainment, and all amenities for tonight's celebration." The silence that followed was deafening. Mateo had seen it all play across their faces: the shock, the confusion, the rapid recalculation of everything they'd assumed about him. Patricia had looked like she'd swallowed something sour. Trevor had actually set down his glass, his earlier smirk completely gone. "Mateo?" Vanessa had whispered, touching his arm. "How did you—" And that's when Mateo had realized he couldn't keep his grandmother's gift a secret anymore. Not after this. Not after watching Vanessa's family treat him like a charity case all night, mocking his adorable effort with their casual cruelty. "My grandmother passed away 8 months ago," Mateo had said quietly, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "She left me her estate. I haven't really talked about it because I was still processing everything, still figuring out what it meant." Richard had leaned forward, his business instincts clearly engaged despite his obvious discomfort. "Your grandmother's estate?" "She was an immigrant, a seamstress in San Francisco," Mateo had continued, meeting Richard's eyes steadily. "She worked hard, saved carefully, invested wisely. She left me everything, about $2 million all told." He'd heard the collective intake of breath around the Caldwell family table. "I wanted to do something special for Vanessa," Mateo had said, looking at his wife, whose eyes were now shining with tears. "She's been working so hard, sacrificing so much. She deserved a perfect night. I didn't tell you because I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted to figure out the financial planning first, to be smart about it, the way my grandmother would have wanted." Trevor had looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Patricia had actually flushed, a rare show of emotion on her typically composed face. But Mateo wasn't done. "I appreciate the offer to help next time," he'd said, his tone polite but firm, looking directly at Patricia and Richard. "But I think we'll be just fine on our own." The cake had arrived then, a 3-tiered masterpiece of white chocolate and raspberry that Vanessa had mentioned loving months ago in a passing conversation Mateo had remembered. The string quartet had started playing "Happy Birthday," and the moment had passed, the party resuming its momentum. But something had shifted. Mateo had felt it in the way Vanessa's colleagues looked at him with new respect, in the way her friends came up to congratulate him on the party, in the way the Caldwell family suddenly found reasons to be very, very quiet. Vanessa had pulled him aside during the cake service, tears streaming down her face. "You did all this?" she'd whispered. "For me?" "Of course for you," Mateo had said, wiping her tears with his thumb. "You're my wife. You're my everything. Why didn't you tell me about your grandmother's estate?" "I wanted to surprise you, and honestly, I needed time to process it. She saved all her life to give me this chance, this security. I wanted to honor that by being thoughtful about it." Vanessa had kissed him then, deeply, not caring who was watching. When she'd pulled back, her expression had been fierce. "My family," she'd started, anger flashing in her eyes, "has always underestimated me," Mateo had finished. "I know. It's okay." "It's not okay," Vanessa had said. "The way Trevor spoke to you, the way my mother— God, Mateo, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize for them," Mateo had said. "Let's just enjoy your party." But as Mateo had looked across the room at the Caldwell family table, he'd seen something in their expressions that made his stomach tighten. It wasn't embarrassment anymore. It wasn't shame. It was calculation. Richard had been typing something on his phone, his expression thoughtful. Patricia had been whispering to Michelle, both women glancing in Mateo's direction. Trevor had been staring at him with an intensity that made Mateo uneasy. All traces of his earlier mockery replaced with something harder to read. They had no idea what was coming, but Mateo was about to learn that the Caldwell family didn't respond to being proven wrong with grace or humility. They responded with strategy, and by the end of the night, as Mateo helped Vanessa into their modest sedan, while the Caldwell family climbed into their luxury vehicles, he'd overheard just enough of Richard and Patricia's conversation to know that his revelation hadn't ended anything. It had started something much worse. "2 million, Richard had been saying to Patricia as they'd waited for their driver. That's not family money. That's not invested wealth. That's liquid assets he has no experience managing. He's a teacher, Patricia had replied. What does he know about wealth preservation? About tax strategies? Mateo had frozen, his hand on the car door. Vanessa already inside and checking her phone. We need to have a conversation with Vanessa, Richard had continued, about protecting her interests, about making sure. They'd noticed Mateo then, and the conversation had stopped abruptly. Richard had smiled that corporate smile that never reached his eyes. Hell of a party, Mateo, he'd said. We should talk sometime. About financial planning. I know some excellent advisors. Mateo had nodded politely, helped Vanessa with her seatbelt, and driven home in silence, his mind racing. Because he'd understood exactly what Richard meant. This wasn't about helping. This was about control. The Caldwell family had just discovered that Mateo wasn't the struggling teacher they could dismiss and condescend to anymore. He was someone with resources, someone with options, someone who could give Vanessa the life she wanted without needing them. And they weren't going to let that stand. What Mateo didn't know, as he'd carried a sleepy Vanessa up to their apartment that night, was that the Caldwell family had already started making plans. Plans that would test his marriage, his integrity, and his resolve in ways he couldn't imagine. They'd spent 3 years treating him like he wasn't good enough for their daughter. Now they were about to spend the next 3 months trying to take everything he'd inherited. And Mateo? He was about to discover that his quiet, observant grandmother had left him more than money. She'd left him the one thing the Caldwell family had never counted on: options. The first strike came on Tuesday morning, 3 days after Vanessa's birthday party. Mateo was in his classroom, preparing a lesson on the Constitutional Convention, when Vanessa called. Her voice had that tight, controlled quality that meant she was in her office, trying not to let her colleagues hear her stress. "Can you talk?" she asked. "I have 10 minutes before first period. What's wrong?" "My father wants to have dinner with both of us tonight." Mateo felt his stomach sink. Tonight? He was very insistent. He said it's important, that he wants to discuss family matters. Vanessa paused. "Mateo, I think this is about your grandmother's estate." "Of course it is," Mateo said, his tone sharper than he'd intended. "Did he say anything specific?" "Just that he's concerned about our financial planning, that he wants to help." Vanessa's voice softened. "I know how my father can be. But maybe this is him trying to make amends? He was embarrassed at the party. They all were." Mateo wanted to believe that. He really did. But he'd seen the look in Richard Caldwell's eyes, heard the calculation in his voice. This wasn't about making amends. "What time?" Mateo asked. 7, at the Sentinel Club. Of course, Richard's territory, his domain, a place where he held all the power and Mateo would be the outsider. "I'll be there," Mateo said. The Sentinel Club occupied the top 3 floors of a historic building in downtown Portland, all dark wood paneling and leather furniture that smelled like old money and older secrets. Mateo had been there once before, for Vanessa's birthday dinner 3 years ago, shortly after they'd gotten married. He'd felt out of place then, wearing his one good suit among men in custom-tailored clothes, discussing stock portfolios and vacation homes. He felt the same way now, walking through the heavy oak doors at 6:55, Vanessa beside him in her work clothes, both of them tired from long days. Richard was waiting in a private dining room, along with Patricia and, surprisingly, a man Matteo didn't recognize. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Matteo's monthly rent. "Matteo, Vanessa," Richard said, standing to greet them with that firm handshake that was more dominance display than greeting. "Thank you for coming on short notice. This is Graham Mitchell. He's one of the premier wealth management advisors in the Pacific Northwest. I asked him to join us." Matteo shook Graham's hand, his guard immediately up. This wasn't a family dinner. This was an ambush. They sat, ordered drinks, went through the motions of small talk while staff brought appetizers that Matteo barely tasted. Finally, after the waiters had cleared the first course, Richard got to the point. "Matteo, I want to apologize for how we treated you at Vanessa's party," he said, and he almost sounded sincere. Almost. "It was inappropriate, and it came from a place of ignorance. We didn't know about your grandmother's estate, and we made assumptions that were unfair." "Thank you," Matteo said carefully. "But that's actually why we're here tonight," Richard continued. "Because while I was wrong about your financial situation, I'm very concerned that you may not have the expertise to manage an inheritance of this size properly. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you have not, because the ending of this story will blow your mind. And drop a comment below telling me what you think Matteo should do next." "I'm working with a financial advisor," Matteo said. "My grandmother's estate lawyer recommended someone." "That's good," Graham interjected smoothly, "but estate lawyers often work with generalist advisors. An inheritance of $2 million requires sophisticated strategies, tax optimization, trust structures, investment diversification. What Graham is saying," Richard added, "is that this is generational wealth. Managed properly, it could be much more than $2 million. Managed poorly," he let the sentence hang. Patricia leaned forward, her expression concerned in a way that might have seemed genuine if Matteo hadn't known her better. "Darling, we just want to make sure you and Vanessa are protected. This is your future, your children's future." Matteo noticed how Patricia had said, "you and Vanessa," but looked only at Vanessa when she said it. "I appreciate the concern," Matteo said evenly, "but I'm being very careful with this. I haven't made any major decisions yet." "Except spending $45,000 on a party," Trevor said, appearing in the doorway with his own drink. Matteo hadn't even known he'd be there. "No judgment, man, but that's what Dad's talking about. That's not careful. That's emotional spending." Vanessa's hand found Matteo's under the table, squeezing hard. "It was my birthday, Trevor, and it was beautiful." "It was," Patricia agreed quickly. "But your brother has a point. $45,000 is a significant amount to spend on a single evening when you're learning to manage this kind of wealth." "Actually," Graham said, pulling out a leather portfolio, "that's exactly the kind of spending that concerns me. I've prepared some projections based on the information Richard shared. If you'd like to see what proper management could look like." He spread several charts across the table, full of graphs and numbers that Matteo actually understood better than they probably expected. He'd taught economics for 2 years before switching to history. The projections showed the $2 million growing to $5 million, then $8 million, then $12 million over various timeframes. "These are based on conservative investment strategies," Graham explained, "but they require discipline. No $45,000 parties, no emotional purchases, a strict budget and investment schedule." "Graham has managed my family's wealth for 20 years, Richard said. "He's grown our portfolio considerably. He could do the same for you." Matteo looked at the charts, then at Graham, then at Richard. He saw it clearly now. The entire strategy laid out before him. They couldn't control him through condescension anymore, so they'd control him through financial advice. Graham would manage the money, report to Richard, and Matteo would slowly lose autonomy over his own inheritance, while the Caldwells regained their position of superiority. These projections assume you move the entire inheritance into managed accounts, Matteo said, pointing to the fine print, with a 2% annual management fee. Staken for this level of service, Graham said. 2% of $2 million is $40,000 a year, Matteo continued. That's what you'd be taking off the top every year, regardless of performance. Graham's smile tightened slightly. The returns more than compensate, and these projected returns assume a bull market that matches the last decade's performance, Matteo interrupted, his teacher instincts kicking in as he analyzed the data. But the fine print here says past performance doesn't guarantee future results. So you're taking 40,000 guaranteed while the gains are theoretical. Richard's expression hardened. Matteo, I understand you're capable of basic math, but wealth management is more complex than a high school teacher can understand, Matteo finished. Is that what you were going to say? The table went silent. Vanessa stood up abruptly. I need to speak with my husband. Alone. She pulled Matteo into the hallway outside the private dining room, her eyes blazing. What the hell is happening in there? Your family is trying to take control of my inheritance, Matteo said flatly. Can't you see it? Graham works for your father. Those fees would go straight to his firm. This isn't about helping us. It's about them maintaining control. They're trying to help, Vanessa insisted, but her voice wavered. My father has experience with this kind of money. We don't. I don't, Matteo corrected. You grew up with it, but you married me anyway, remember? The poor teacher who wasn't good enough for the Caldwell family. Vanessa flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? 3 days ago they were mocking me for spending my teacher's salary on your party. Now they're suddenly concerned about my financial future? They're embarrassed, Vanessa. Embarrassed that I proved them wrong, and they're trying to regain the upper hand. Or maybe they're genuinely trying to help, and you're too proud to see it, Vanessa shot back. Not everything is about class warfare, Matteo. Tell that to your brother, who literally mocked my salary in front of 60 people. They stared at each other, the first real argument of their marriage crackling in the air between them. Finally, Vanessa spoke, her voice quiet. What do you want to do? I want to talk to my own advisors, Matteo said. People I choose, not people your father chooses for me. I want to make decisions about my inheritance without your family's involvement. They're trying to help us. There's no conspiracy here. Then why does it feel like one? Vanessa didn't have an answer for that. They returned to the dining room, where the Caldwell family was waiting with expressions of concern that didn't quite reach their eyes. Matteo sat down, took a breath, and delivered his decision. I appreciate you all taking the time tonight, he said, and Graham, I appreciate the analysis, but I'm going to handle my grandmother's estate independently. I'll be working with my own advisors, making my own decisions. Richard's jaw tightened. Matteo, that's a mistake. You don't have the experience. Then I'll learn, Matteo said firmly. That's what my grandmother would have wanted. She built this wealth through her own work, her own decisions. I'm going to honor that by doing the same. You're going to honor it by squandering it, Trevor muttered. Trevor, Vanessa warned, her voice sharp. But Patricia leaned forward, her expression hardening into something Matteo had never seen before. Genuine anger beneath the society veneer. Matteo, I think you need to understand something, she said, her voice cold. Vanessa is our daughter. We love her, and we want what's best for her. If you're going to make reckless financial decisions that affect her future, then we have a responsibility to protect her interests. What's that supposed to mean? Matteo asked. It means, Richard said slowly, that we think you and Vanessa should consider a post-nuptial agreement. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. A post-nuptial agreement? Vanessa repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Just to protect both of you, Patricia said quickly, to ensure that the inheritance remains separate property, that if anything were to happen. You mean a divorce, Matteo said flatly. You're asking us to plan for a divorce. We're asking you to be realistic, Richard said. 50% of marriages end in divorce. We've seen too many families torn apart by financial disputes. A postnup simply clarifies things, protects both parties. It protects your daughter from her husband, Mateo said, standing up. That's what you mean. You want me to sign away any claim to what my grandmother left me, to make sure Vanessa gets her share if we split up, because you still don't trust me. You still think I'm some gold digger who married above his station. Mateo, please sit down, Graham said in that condescending tone wealthy people used when they wanted you to be reasonable. This is a standard practice for— I'm not standard, Mateo interrupted. I'm your daughter's husband, the man she chose to marry, and you've spent 3 years making it clear that I'm not good enough, that I don't belong in your world. Well, guess what? I don't want to belong in your world. I want to build my own world, with Vanessa, on our terms. He looked at Vanessa, who was staring at her plate, tears streaming silently down her face. I'm leaving, Mateo said. Vanessa, you can stay or come with me. Your choice. He walked out of the Sentinel Club without looking back, his heart pounding, his hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. He made it to the sidewalk before Vanessa caught up with him, grabbing his arm. Mateo, wait! He turned, half expecting her to ask him to go back, to apologize, to consider the postnup. But instead, she threw her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't know they were going to do that. I swear I didn't know. Mateo held her, feeling his anger deflate into exhaustion. I believe you. A postnup, Vanessa said, pulling back to look at him, her mascara running. Like we're already planning to fail. Like they think you're just waiting to take my money. Your grandmother's money, Mateo corrected gently. Not yours. Mine. That's what makes them so angry. They stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, traffic rushing past, the warm glow of the Sentinel Club's windows above them. Mateo could see shadows moving in the private dining room, where the Caldwell family was probably discussing their next move. What do we do? Vanessa asked. We go home, Mateo said. We talk. We figure this out together. But as they walked to Mateo's car, he caught a glimpse of Richard Caldwell watching them from the club's window, his phone to his ear, his expression calculating. This wasn't over, it was just beginning, and Mateo was about to discover that the Caldwell family had resources he'd never anticipated, connections he'd never imagined, and a willingness to fight dirty that would test everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and love. Because 3 days later, Mateo received a letter from one of Portland's most prestigious law firms. The Caldwell family was suing him for financial fraud, claiming that his grandmother's estate had been obtained through elder abuse and that he'd manipulated a vulnerable woman for personal gain. They were trying to take everything, and they were using Vanessa's own law firm to do it. Mateo stared at the legal documents spread across their kitchen table, his hands trembling. The letter was on heavy cream paper with embossed letterhead. Patterson and Associates, one of the most powerful corporate law firms on the West Coast. The same firm where Vanessa worked. They can't do this, Vanessa said, pacing the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. They can't use my firm to sue my husband. It's a conflict of interest. She stopped, listening to whoever was on the other end. What do you mean they cleared it with the ethics committee? Mateo read through the complaint again, each accusation more outrageous than the last. The Caldwells claimed that Eleanor Wesley had been suffering from diminished mental capacity when she'd updated her will. That Mateo had isolated her from other family members. What other family members? Mateo thought bitterly, when he'd been her only regular visitor? That the $2 million estate was disproportionate and suggested undue influence. They were painting his grandmother as a victim and him as a predator. Vanessa ended her call, her face pale. My managing partner says the firm vetted the case thoroughly. Since I'm not involved in the litigation department and you're not a client of the firm, there's no technical conflict. My father made sure of that. Of course he did, Mateo said numbly. There's more. Vanessa sat down heavily. They're requesting a full forensic audit of your grandmother's estate. They want to examine every transaction she made in the last 5 years of her life, every withdrawal, every change to her will. And they're asking for a temporary restraining order to freeze the estate assets pending the outcome of the investigation. Mateo felt the room spin. They're trying to freeze the money? All of it? That's what they're asking for. The hearing is in 3 days. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Mateo's situation. Mateo stood up, started to pace. This is insane. My grandmother was sharp until the day she died. She was doing crossword puzzles in Chinese and English, managing her own finances, taking the bus to her volunteer work at the community center. She had a full mental capacity evaluation done by her doctor 6 months before she died, specifically because she wanted to make sure the will wouldn't be challenged. Do you have that evaluation? Vanessa asked. Mr. Harrison should have it. He's her estate lawyer. Mateo grabbed his phone. I need to call him right now. But when he reached Mr. Harrison, the news got worse. I received the complaint this morning, Harrison said, his elderly voice tired. Mateo, I have to be honest with you. This kind of challenge is difficult to fight. The Caldwells have resources and they're alleging elder abuse. Even if the claims are baseless, the legal fees alone could drain a significant portion of the estate. So what do I do? You need a litigator, someone who specializes in estate disputes. I can give you some names, but Mateo, Harrison paused, these attorneys don't come cheap. You're looking at a retainer of at least $50,000, and the case could cost several $100,000 to fight properly. Mateo felt sick. So they're forcing me to spend my inheritance defending my right to my inheritance? I'm afraid that's exactly what they're doing. Over the next 48 hours, Mateo learned exactly how ruthless the Caldwell family could be when they wanted something. The story hit the legal community gossip circuit. Wealthy teacher inherits suspicious fortune from elderly grandmother, family challenges estate. Vanessa started getting questions at work, sympathetic looks from colleagues who thought she was married to an elder abuser. The local news picked it up, a human interest story. Family claims teacher exploited grandmother for millions. Mateo's principal called him in for a meeting. I'm not saying I believe any of this, Principal Brennan said carefully, but parents are calling. They're concerned. Until this is resolved, I think it's best if you take a leave of absence. You're suspending me? I'm protecting you and the school. Paid leave, Mateo, just until this blows over. But it wasn't blowing over. It was getting worse. The temporary restraining order hearing was held in front of Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for being thorough. The Caldwells had brought in Arthur Patterson himself, the founding partner of Patterson and Associates, a legal legend known for winning impossible cases. Mateo had managed to hire Diane Wesley, no relation, a tough estate litigation attorney who came highly recommended but whose retainer had indeed cost him $50,000 from the estate. Arthur Patterson presented his case with theatrical precision. He showed financial records of Mateo's grandmother's modest lifestyle, the same apartment for 40 years, the clipped coupons, the thrift store clothes. He contrasted it with the $2 million estate and suggested it was evidence of someone being taken advantage of, not someone making smart financial decisions. Your Honor, Patterson said, his voice grave, we have a vulnerable, elderly immigrant woman who lived in poverty despite having millions of dollars. Why? Because her grandson convinced her to save every penny for him. He visited her every week, not out of love, but to ensure she stayed isolated, dependent, and grateful. This is textbook financial exploitation of the elderly. Mateo wanted to scream. His grandmother had lived modestly because that was who she was, because she'd grown up poor and never lost those habits, because she found joy in simplicity, not excess. But how did you prove someone's character in a courtroom? Diane Wesley fought back hard. She presented the mental capacity evaluation, medical records showing Eleanor Wesley's perfect cognitive health. She showed the will had been updated by Eleanor's choice, that she'd consulted independently with multiple attorneys and financial advisors, that every decision had been carefully documented. But Patterson had an answer for everything. Mental capacity doesn't preclude emotional manipulation, Your Honor. In fact, the records show that Mr. Mateo Wesley was the only family member visiting her regularly. Where were the friends? Where was the community? Why was she so isolated? She wasn't isolated, Mateo said loudly, unable to stop himself. She had friends at the community center. She played mahjong every Thursday. She went to church. She lived her life exactly how she wanted to live it. Judge Morrison gavelled for order. Mr. Wesley, please let your attorney speak for you. The hearing lasted 3 hours. In the end, Judge Morrison delivered her ruling. Based on the evidence presented, I find that there are sufficient questions about the circumstances of Mrs. Eleanor Wesley's estate planning to warrant further investigation. However, I do not find sufficient cause to freeze the entire estate. Instead, I'm ordering that 75% of the estate assets be placed in a restricted account pending the outcome of this case. Mr. Wesley may access the remaining 25% for reasonable living expenses and legal fees. It was a compromise, but it felt like a loss. Mateo walked out of the courthouse with access to just $500,000, while $1.5 million sat frozen, untouchable. Vanessa was waiting outside, having taken the morning off work. She hugged him tight. "I'm quitting my job," she said. Mateo pulled back. "What? No, Vanessa, you can't." "I can't work for the firm that's attacking my husband," she said firmly. "I already talked to my managing partner. I'm giving 2 weeks' notice." "But your career means nothing if I lose you," Vanessa said. "Mateo, I've been so blind. I kept making excuses for my family, kept thinking they had good intentions. But this is evil. They're trying to destroy you, to paint your grandmother as a victim and you as an abuser. I won't stand for it." That night, Vanessa made a call that changed everything. She called her Aunt Michelle, her mother's sister, the one who'd complained about the domestic champagne at the birthday party. But Michelle had always been different from the rest of the Caldwells. She'd married a middle-class accountant instead of another tech millionaire, lived in a normal house instead of a mansion, drove a Toyota instead of a European luxury car. "Aunt Michelle," Vanessa said with Mateo listening on speaker, "I need to ask you something. Did you know what my parents were planning? The lawsuit?" There was a long pause. "I knew they were angry about the inheritance. I didn't know they'd take it this far. It's destroying us. Mateo's reputation, his job, everything. And it's all lies. He loved his grandmother. He took care of her." Another pause. Then, "Vanessa, there's something you should know. Something I've never told anyone." What Michelle revealed would turn the entire case upside down. 25 years ago, when Patricia Caldwell had been caring for her own mother during a difficult illness, there had been money missing from her mother's accounts. Not a lot, maybe $50,000 over 2 years, but it had been taken systematically, withdrawn regularly, always in cash amounts just under the reporting threshold. Patricia had blamed a caregiver, fired her, never reported it to police. But Michelle had always suspected differently. She'd seen Patricia's spending during that time, seen the designer clothes and jewelry that didn't match her financial situation. "I never had proof," Michelle said, "and by the time our mother died, the money was gone. But I always wondered, and now watching Patricia accuse someone else of elder abuse," she paused, "it feels like projection." "Can you testify to this?" Diane Wesley asked when Vanessa brought her the information the next day. "I don't have hard evidence," Vanessa said, "just my aunt's suspicions." "It's enough to request discovery on the Caldwell's own financial history," Diane said, a predatory smile crossing her face. If Patricia is accusing Mateo of elder financial abuse, her own history with elderly family members' finances is absolutely relevant. And if we find something, they found something. The discovery request went through, and the Caldwell's attorneys fought it viciously, which only made Diane more determined. When the judge ordered limited financial disclosure, the records told a story that even Arthur Patterson couldn't spin. During the exact 2-year period when Patricia's mother had been ill, Patricia had made cash deposits totaling $48,000 into various personal accounts. The deposits had stopped exactly 1 month after her mother's death. When confronted with the records, Patricia claimed they were gifts from her mother. But there was no documentation, no checks, no paper trail except the cash deposits that matched almost perfectly with the missing withdrawals from her mother's accounts. Diane filed an emergency motion to dismiss the case against Mateo, attaching the new evidence and Michelle's sworn affidavit. She also filed a countersuit for malicious prosecution and defamation. The Caldwell's response was swift and desperate. Arthur Patterson tried to argue that Patricia's finances were irrelevant to Mateo's case. But Judge Morrison, who'd been watching the case carefully, was losing patience. "Mr. Patterson," she said during the emergency hearing, "your clients have accused Mr. Wesley of elder financial abuse based on circumstantial evidence. Now we have evidence that Mrs. Caldwell herself may have engaged in exactly the behavior she's accusing Mr. Wesley of committing. This speaks directly to the credibility and motives of your clients." "Your Honor, I'm dismissing the case," Judge Morrison said firmly. "The allegations against Mr. Wesley are unsupported and appear to be motivated by animus rather than genuine concern. The freeze on the estate assets is lifted immediately. Furthermore, I'm awarding Mr. Wesley legal fees and ordering the plaintiffs to pay for the cost of this proceeding." The courtroom erupted. Mateo felt Vanessa grab his hand, felt Diane Wesley's congratulatory pat on his shoulder. But he was watching Richard Caldwell's face as the reality sank in. They'd lost, publicly and completely. The legal fees alone cost the Caldwells over $200,000. But the real cost was their reputation. The story that had painted Mateo as an elder abuser now shifted. Patricia Caldwell's own suspected abuse of her mother became the narrative, spread through the same gossip networks that had condemned Mateo weeks earlier. Vanessa quit her job as planned and took a position at a smaller firm that specialized in estate planning and elder law. "I want to help people like your grandmother," she said, "people who save carefully and deserve to have their wishes honored." Mateo returned to his classroom to a standing ovation from his students, who'd followed the case and believed in him from the start. Principal Brennan apologized personally, but the biggest change came in Mateo's relationship with the Caldwell family. Richard called, finally, 3 weeks after the case was dismissed. His voice was different, not the confident corporate tone Mateo had always known, but something smaller, more human. "I was wrong," Richard said simply. "About you, about your grandmother, about everything. I let my pride and my prejudice blind me to who you really are." "Why did you do it?" Mateo asked. "Why try to destroy me?" "Because I was threatened," Richard admitted. "You had resources independent of us. You didn't need us anymore. And I realized that meant Vanessa didn't need us anymore either. We were losing control, losing our daughter, and I panicked. I fought back the only way I knew how, with money and lawyers. You almost destroyed my life. I know, and I can't take that back, but I'm asking for a chance to make it right." Mateo thought about his grandmother, about her wisdom and her quiet strength. She'd taught him that forgiveness wasn't about excusing bad behavior. It was about freeing yourself from anger. "I'll forgive you," Mateo said, "eventually, but I won't forget. And my relationship with your daughter doesn't depend on my relationship with you anymore. We're building our own life on our own terms." "I understand," Richard said. "That's fair." Patricia never apologized. She withdrew from public life for a while, Her charity board positions quietly ended. The investigation into her mother's finances was never formally pursued, but the questions lingered. Trevor sent a text. "You won. Congrats. Maybe I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, but from Trevor, it was probably the closest Matteo would get. 6 months later, Matteo and Vanessa hosted a small dinner party at their new home, a modest but comfortable house they'd purchased with part of the inheritance. The guest list included Mr. Harrison, Diane Wesley, Aunt Michelle, and a few close friends. No Caldwells. As Matteo raised his glass to toast, he thought about his grandmother, about the life she'd lived and the gift she'd given him. Not just money, but the freedom to choose his own path. "To Eleanor Wesley," he said, "who taught me that real wealth isn't about how much money you have. It's about living with integrity, working hard, and never letting anyone make you feel small." Everyone drank to that. Later, as guests were leaving, Vanessa pulled Matteo aside on their new back porch. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Standing up to my family? Fighting back?" "Not for a second," Matteo said. "Your grandmother left me more than an inheritance. She left me options. And I chose to use those options to build a life I'm proud of, with a woman I love, on terms that honor both of us. Even if it meant losing my family." "We didn't lose them," Matteo said. "We just redefined what family means to us. And that's okay." Vanessa smiled, leaning into him. "I love you, Matteo Wesley. I love you too." The lesson Matteo learned, the one he'd carry forward for the rest of his life, was this: sometimes people will try to make you small because it makes them feel big. They'll attack your worth, question your value, try to take what's yours because they can't stand to see you succeed on your own terms. But real strength isn't about fighting back with the same weapons. It's about knowing your worth, standing your ground, and refusing to let anyone else's prejudice define who you are. His grandmother had known that. She'd lived it every day, working quietly, saving carefully, building a legacy through dignity and determination. And now Matteo knew it too. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts for new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.